It started as an ordinary summer road trip. I had just graduated from college and wanted a few weeks to myself before starting work, so I decided to drive from New York to California. I had always loved the idea of seeing the country alone, discovering little towns, eating in random diners, and sleeping wherever I felt like, whether that was a cheap motel or a quiet roadside rest area. I mapped out a rough route along back roads when possible, wanting to avoid the highways and experience a slower, more personal journey. I left in early July with my car packed with a few essentials, a cooler full of snacks, and my camera, hoping to document the trip. The first couple of days were uneventful. I passed through Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana, stopping at local diners for breakfast, wandering through small towns, and photographing abandoned barns and grain silos. I stayed in motels most nights, cheap places with cracked linoleum floors and flickering neon signs. Nothing out of the ordinary happened until I hit Illinois. I was driving late in the evening along a rural stretch of highway, the kind that seems to disappear into the cornfields on either side. I was tired, so I decided to pull off at a small town I hadn't planned to visit, Harperville. The town was almost deserted when I arrived, the streets lined with old brick buildings, some boarded up, others with signs of recent life. I found a motel on the outskirts, the kind with peeling paint and a faint smell of mildew. The clerk, an older man with a sun-weathered face, gave me a room key without saying much. I didn't mind. I just wanted a bed. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing noises in the hallway, soft shuffling, whispers, doors opening and closing. But whenever I listened carefully, everything stopped. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just an old building settling, but the feeling of being watched was unmistakable. I stayed up until nearly 3 a.m., watching the hallway light flicker as the air conditioner rattled. Eventually, exhaustion overcame fear, and I fell asleep. I woke to the sun streaming through the curtains. The first thing I noticed was that my car had a faint layer of dust on it, almost like it hadn't been moved in days, even though I had parked it outside just the evening before. I shrugged it off and got back on the road. My plan was to cut across Iowa and head toward Nebraska, exploring small towns and old farmhouses along the way. The next day, as I drove through a stretch of open farmland in Iowa, I passed a cornfield that seemed to stretch for miles. I pulled over, wanting to take some photographs of the late afternoon sun cutting through the stalks. The air was thick with the smell of dry corn husks and dirt. As I set up my camera, I noticed something odd. A man standing at the far edge of the field watching me. He was tall and thin, wearing what looked like old overalls, and his face was hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. I waved, and he didn't respond. When I blinked and looked again, he was gone. I convinced myself it was just a trick of the light or my imagination. That night, I stopped in a small town called Dunlap. I found a diner and asked about motels. The waitress, a young woman with tired eyes, recommended one on the outskirts of town. But she paused and added, "Be careful out there. Some folks have had strange experiences." I laughed it off, assuming she meant drunk drivers or bears. Later, I realized she didn't smile when she said it, and her warning didn't sound casual. I stayed at the motel she recommended. It was a single-story building with a long corridor, each room door evenly spaced and plain. I got to my room, but something felt off. The air smelled faintly of mildew and rust, and the lights flickered. I tried to settle in, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was just outside my room, lingering. The hallway was empty when I looked, but I kept hearing faint whispers, almost like someone calling my name from a distance. I turned on the TV to distract myself, but the static was louder than the channel's signal, and I could swear I heard something moving in the static. A whisper, a laugh, a soft step. The next morning, I left early, heading west into Nebraska. The roads became more isolated, and the landscape opened into rolling plains dotted with abandoned farmhouses. I decided to explore one of them, a weathered two-story house with boarded-up windows. I parked my car and walked up the cracked walkway. The front door creaked when I pushed it open, and the inside smelled like dust and mold. As I walked through the house, I noticed something chilling. Fresh footprints in the thick layer of dust on the floor. They were small, adult size, but I was sure I was the first person there in years. The footprints led to the back door, which was slightly ajar. I left immediately, my stomach in knots. That night, I stayed at a motel in Kearney, a small town with a few diners and a gas station. I kept thinking about the footprints, the cornfield watcher, and the strange feeling from the night before. When I checked into the motel, the clerk, an older woman, handed me a key without looking at me and muttered something I couldn't hear. I shrugged it off, but later that night I could swear I heard footsteps outside my room again, soft but deliberate. I didn't dare check. The following day, I entered western Nebraska. I drove through stretches of empty highway, flanked on either side by fields of wheat and corn. The sun was harsh, and the air seemed unnaturally still. Around noon, I passed a small rest area and decided to stop. There was an older man sitting on a bench, staring at the ground. When I approached, he looked up, his eyes unnervingly still, almost lifeless. He didn't speak, just nodded faintly. I waved and continued my drive, but a sense of unease stayed with me. By mid-afternoon, I took a detour onto a dirt road I had read about online. It was supposed to lead to an abandoned railway town. The directions were vague. Turn left at the old silo, keep going until the road ends, look for the remnants of the station. I followed the instructions, the GPS losing signal as I drove deeper into the countryside. Eventually, I reached the area. What remained of the town was skeletal. Collapsed wooden buildings, rusted railway tracks, and a toppled water tower. The place was silent, unnaturally so. I parked my car and began photographing the ruins. As I wandered, I felt the air grow colder, and the shadows lengthened in ways that didn't make sense with the sun's position. I paused near the old railway station and heard it. A faint whisper carried by the wind, almost imperceptible. "Leave, now." I froze. The voice was soft, urgent, but distant. I convinced myself it was just the wind, but the chill crawling up my spine suggested otherwise. I continued exploring, but every step seemed to echo unnaturally, as if the buildings themselves were amplifying my presence. Then I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the tracks. Tall, thin, hunched slightly, wearing ragged clothing. Its face was obscured, but I could feel its gaze. I raised my camera to snap a photo, and the figure didn't move, didn't blink, just stared. When the flash went off, it disappeared. No footprints, no trace. Terrified, I returned to my car and drove back to the main highway. Night was falling, and the sky turned a deep, bruised purple. I passed another small town, this one called Ogallala. I stopped for gas, trying to calm myself. The attendant, a young man with dark circles under his eyes, didn't speak much, just handed me a map with a lot of scribbles. "Follow the main roads," he said. "Don't stray onto the dirt. Some roads don't like visitors." I laughed nervously and left, but his serious expression made me uneasy. The next day, I drove into Colorado, heading toward the Rockies. The scenery changed dramatically. Plains giving way to hills, hills giving way to pine forests. Around sunset, I stopped along a quiet road to photograph a line of trees on a hillside. I stepped out, the air smelling fresh and piney. As I crouched to adjust my camera, I realized my car keys were gone. My heart raced. I checked my pockets, the car, the ground. Nothing. Then I heard footsteps, crunching through pine needles, moving toward me. I turned, and there it was again, the tall, thin figure. Closer now, moving deliberately, silently. Panic surged. I ran to the car, fumbling to open the door. The figure stopped just beyond the headlights and raised a hand slowly. I couldn't see a face, just darkness. I slammed the door, locked it, and started the engine. The figure didn't move, didn't vanish, but eventually I accelerated, putting distance between us. I drove through the night, unsure of where I was going. Every little noise, the creak of the car, the rustle of leaves, distant wildlife, made me jump. I kept thinking about the cornfield, the footprints, the railway town, the figure in the trees. I had no plan, just the desperate need to get somewhere populated, somewhere safe. By morning, I reached Denver. Relief washed over me as I drove into the city streets, filled with cars, people, and noise. I parked my car and sat for a long time, trying to calm down, convincing myself I had imagined everything, that fatigue and the isolation had played tricks on my mind. But when I reviewed the photos from my trip, my heart sank. Figures appeared in the images, shadowy, impossible forms, standing where I hadn't seen anyone. In some, the tall, thin figure was closer, always just out of reach, always watching. I never returned to the Midwest. Friends laughed when I told them the story, suggesting it was my imagination, the product of traveling alone and exhaustion. But I knew better. I had seen it, felt it, followed by it. Even now, years later, when I drive past empty fields or abandoned buildings, I feel the same prickling sense of being watched. And sometimes, when I look at those old photographs, I swear I can see them waiting just beyond the frame, ready for the next traveler who strays too far from the road. Story the end. The tires crunched against the gravel shoulder as I veered off the interstate. My phone, already hovering at 8% battery, had lost service 10 minutes back. I had ignored the signs pointing toward a scenic route, shortcut, but after staring at the map on the dashboard, I convinced myself it would save an hour. Twilight was bleeding across the horizon, painting the sky in deep purples and bruised oranges, and the shadows of the tall pines along the road seemed to reach into the car like they were trying to pull me off the path. I told myself I wasn't scared, that I had traveled alone plenty of times before. But after 10 minutes of winding roads, I noticed something off. The forest was unnaturally silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, not even the hum of insects. It wasn't eerie in a natural way. It was the kind of silence that presses against your ears. It makes your teeth chatter for no reason. I shrugged it off, blaming the long drive and my caffeine crash. Then I saw the first house. It was small, one story, with a steep roof and peeling paint. Its windows were dark, but the way it sat against the clearing, framed by gnarled oaks, made it feel alive, like it was watching. I slowed, curious, trying to convince myself it was just old country architecture, but something about it made my stomach tighten. I thought I saw a figure inside, moving slowly, but when I blinked, it was gone. I kept driving. The road twisted and bent, taking me deeper into the woods. The GPS refused to reroute, which was strange because I was supposedly still on the path. My headlights reflected off something on the side of the road. I stopped, squinting. It looked like an old gas station sign, rusted over, half fallen, swinging in the wind. The letters were mostly gone, but I could just make out Hawthorne. That was it. Hawthorne. Not a town on my map, not a dot in Google. Nothing. Just the road, the forest, and this old, abandoned sign. I laughed nervously, tried to shake the creeping unease. Maybe it was a private road. Maybe I had accidentally stumbled onto a property line. I should have turned around, but the sunset was fading, and the thought of driving back the same winding path made my nerves tighten. I pressed on. Night fell fast. The car's headlights barely pushed through the dense trees. Everything beyond the beams was black. My music had died when my phone died, leaving only the hum of the engine and the wind scraping against the windows. Then I saw movement again. At first, I thought it was a deer. Something large, almost humanoid, standing at the edge of the road. Its shape was wrong, long and thin, with limbs that seemed to bend in ways that shouldn't be possible. I slammed on the brakes. My heart hammering, I flicked the high beams, but the figure was gone. I told myself I was imagining things. The exhaustion, the isolation, it had to be that. Minutes later, my car's engine sputtered and died. The dashboard lit up red, warning lights flashing. I tried restarting it. Nothing. Cold sweat ran down my back. My phone flashed a single bar of service, enough to call 911, but the line kept cutting out. Static, then silence. I realized I had passed the last gas station almost 2 hours ago. I was stranded, deep in a forest that didn't exist on any modern map, with something out there watching. I decided to leave the car. My survival instincts kicked in. I grabbed my flashlight, a bottle of water, and a pocket knife I always carried when traveling alone. I figured I could follow the road to the next town, or find a house, anything. I started walking. The air was thick, suffocating, like walking underwater. Every step I took, I felt eyes on me. The sounds of the forest were gone, replaced by a low, constant hum, like hundreds of insects buzzing just out of sight. Then I heard it, a footstep, crunching gravel, right behind me. I froze. "Hello," I called, my voice shaking. My words were swallowed by the forest. The step paused. Another came. I turned slowly. Nothing. I started walking faster, my flashlight slicing through the darkness, illuminating nothing but trees. Then I saw the house again, smaller now, closer than it should be. Its windows glowed faintly like candles inside, though no smoke rose from the chimney. Something compelled me to approach. I wasn't thinking, I was drawn. As I neared, I saw faces pressed against the glass, children's faces, pale, wide-eyed, their mouths moving silently. When I stepped closer, they vanished. I knocked on the door. No response, just the eerie flicker of lights inside. I circled the house, my flashlight beam shaking. That's when I saw it. A single photograph lying on the ground, yellowed with age. I picked it up. A family, smiling in front of the same house, decades ago perhaps. But the faces, they weren't smiling. Their eyes were hollow, dark, empty. The photograph burned against my palm like cold iron. I dropped it. From inside the house, I heard a creak, a floorboard, moving slowly, and then a whisper, "Don't go." I ran. Branches whipped my face. Roots threatened to trip me, but I ran. Behind me, laughter, soft at first, then rising into a cacophony that made my teeth ache. I didn't dare look back. I didn't dare stop. The road twisted again, and I stumbled into a clearing. A car, old, rusted, sitting in the middle of the road, headlights on, engine running, but empty. I didn't care. I jumped in, turned the key. The engine roared. I didn't look at the mirror, just drove. For what felt like hours, I drove. Every so often, I would glimpse something at the edge of my headlights, figures standing still in the trees, staring, and then just as quickly, gone. My mind screamed hallucination, sleep deprivation, but the fear clawed at me with teeth and nails. Finally, the forest thinned. I saw lights ahead, a road sign. I recognized the highway. I'd made it back to civilization. Relief surged. But as I passed the last curve, my headlights caught something on the side of the road. The house. The same house. Impossibly, right there in the clearing. My stomach dropped. This shouldn't exist here. I blinked. It was gone. At a diner 20 minutes later, I sat in a booth, shaking, ordering coffee. I tried to explain to the waitress where I had been. She looked at me with that polite smile people give travelers who have obviously had too much sun, too little sleep. "Hawthorne? You mean up the old forest road?" she asked. "That's been abandoned for decades. Nobody lives there. Kids used to dare each other to go out there at night. They say the family, well, they disappeared. Nobody knows what happened." I nodded mutely. My car was fine, by the way, like it had never died at all. My phone charged normally once plugged in, everything back to normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Every time I drove, I checked the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that thin figure, bending its limbs in impossible ways, moving closer. Weeks later, I found myself staring at a travel forum online. I typed Hawthorne into the search bar. No hits, nothing, like it never existed. Not the road, not the house, not the rusted sign, just a blank map, and that's when the calls started. My phone, the same one that now worked perfectly, began ringing at night. No number. When I answered, just breathing on the other end. Sometimes a whisper, sometimes laughter. Always the same cadence, slow, deliberate, like it was counting the seconds until it found me. I moved states, new job, new apartment. The first few nights, silence, but soon, shadows in corners, reflections that didn't match my movements. I caught glimpses in mirrors, tall, thin, twisted shapes, always at the edge of my vision. I tried to tell myself it was paranoia, PSD from a long drive, but deep down, I knew. It wasn't over, and it never would be, because the forest had a way of following you. The house had a way of finding you, and the family, if they ever existed, was still out there, waiting. One night, weeks after the first call, I woke to the sound of my front door creaking. I lived alone, no keys in the lock. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept next to the bed, heart pounding, and crept to the living room. Nothing. I exhaled, trying to calm myself. Then I saw it, written in the condensation on my window, "You shouldn't have left." I left that city the next morning, sold the apartment, sold the car, left everything. But no matter where I go, when I wake in the dead of night, I hear the faint crunch of gravel. I see the trees at the edge of the road, black silhouettes that shouldn't exist. And sometimes I swear I see that house, just for a moment, in a clearing, the lights flickering, waiting for me to come home. I have never traveled alone since. I have never taken a shortcut through the forest. And I will never, ever ignore a sign pointing me toward the open road. Story the end. It was supposed to be a simple road trip, nothing fancy, just a long weekend getaway from Chicago to the Great Smoky Mountains. I had been planning it for months, needing a break from work, from my tiny apartment, from everything that felt suffocating about my life. I wasn't alone. My best friend Mark was driving. He had a beat-up Ford Explorer that smelled faintly of stale coffee and gym socks, but it had enough space for camping gear and our two dogs, Max and Ruby. We left early Friday morning, coffee in hand, playlist loaded, and a vague sense of freedom pushing us forward. The drive was uneventful at first. the kind of mundane that somehow makes you feel like you're really doing something important. We hit a diner just off I-75 in Kentucky around noon, grabbing greasy burgers and fries. Mark was in his usual mood, half joking, half brooding. "Man, I can't wait to get to the mountains," he said, rubbing his hands together. "Somewhere without cell service, without anyone asking for anything, just us, nature, and these idiots." He nodded at Max and Ruby, who were huffing excitedly in the back seat. By late afternoon, we were well into Tennessee. The GPS insisted we follow a shortcut that cut off the interstate and took us along a series of winding back roads promising scenic views. It was here that things started to feel off. Not immediately terrifying, just subtly unsettling. The sun was starting to dip, casting long shadows across the forested ridges, and the road narrowed. No other cars were around. The radio kept cutting out, static creeping between songs, the kind of static that seems to whisper when you aren't paying attention. We passed an old, abandoned gas station. The windows were shattered, doors hanging off hinges, and graffiti covering the walls. I tried not to stare, but something about it made me grip the edge of my seat. Mark didn't notice, too focused on keeping the Explorer on the narrow, twisting road. As we drove past, I saw movement, or at least thought I did. A figure, maybe, standing by the side of the building. Pale, thin, almost blending into the shadows. I blinked and it was gone. I mentioned it to Mark. He laughed. "Probably just a deer or something. Quit scaring yourself." I wanted to believe him. Night fell quickly. The GPS signal started flickering, the familiar blue dot bouncing around the screen. We were somewhere deep in the forest, though the map insisted we were on a road that didn't seem real. One wrong turn, Mark said, and we'd been driving in what felt like circles. That's when the first sound hit us, not from outside the car, but inside our heads. A kind of low, whispering hum. Not words, not anything intelligible, but an unmistakable presence. Max and Ruby stiffened, growling softly, ears pinned back. "Okay," Mark said, trying to joke through the tension. "That's new." He fiddled with the radio, hoping to drown it out. Nothing. Static, static, static. Then, faintly, a sound that made my stomach drop. Footsteps on gravel. Heavy, slow, methodical, like someone walking parallel to the car. I looked out the side window. Nothing. I strained my eyes in the dark, saw the outlines of trees, maybe rocks, but no one walking. And yet the sound persisted, following us. I told Mark again. This time he frowned, gripping the wheel tighter. Maybe it's just, I don't know, wildlife. Deer, elk, could be anything. We found a campsite just before midnight. It was advertised as remote, and it was. The ranger station was empty, the trails deserted, the only lights are headlights slicing through the dark. We parked, unloaded the tent, and got a fire going. Max and Ruby didn't want to leave the car, whining softly. I tried to calm them, tried to convince myself this was just nerves. The forest around us was quiet, too quiet. Even the usual nighttime critters seemed absent. The hum followed us, faint but persistent, just at the edge of hearing. I tried to brush it off, blaming fatigue or imagination. By 2 a.m., sleep was impossible. The forest seemed alive in a way that felt wrong. The hum had grown louder, or maybe I had just grown more aware. Then came the knocking. Not on the tent, not on anything wooden, but something rhythmic and deliberate. On the air itself, it felt like 3 slow, deliberate taps. I froze. The dogs growled again, sharper this time, hackles raised. Mark mumbled something about wind or branches, but I knew it wasn't natural. The taps came again, followed by a low whispering that seemed to drift around us, circling. "Who's there?" I called, my voice shaking. No answer, only the whispering, the taps, and the feeling that we were being watched by something impossibly close. I could see the fire flicker, shadows stretching, folding, bending in ways that made no sense. Mark shined his flashlight into the woods. Nothing. Nothing moved, but I could swear something was crouched just beyond the reach of the beam. My stomach nodded. We spent the rest of the night in the car, windows up, engine running, dogs pressed against us, trying to convince ourselves it was nothing. Morning came reluctantly. The forest looked normal, harmless even, drenched in mist and sunlight. We packed up, nerves raw but relieved to move. We decided to push deeper into the park, hoping distance and daylight would help. Around midday, the first real horror hit. We were hiking along a trail when we stumbled across a small, crumbling cabin. It looked abandoned for decades, roof sagging, windows boarded up. There were strange symbols carved into the wood, circles with lines radiating outward, scratches that seemed almost ritualistic. The air smelled of damp earth and something sour, metallic. I felt it before I saw it, the unmistakable sensation of eyes on me, watching, following. Mark noticed it too. We exchanged a glance. Inside, the cabin was worse. The floor was littered with bones, small animal bones probably, but something felt off about them, arranged in patterns. On the walls, crude drawings of human figures, distorted, screaming, overlapping. I couldn't look directly, kept my eyes to the floor. Mark muttered something about vandalism or a trapper's cabin, but his voice lacked conviction. And then we saw the footprints, bare human feet pressed into the mud outside the cabin. They weren't ours, not ours at all, and they led away from the cabin in a straight, impossible line, disappearing into the woods. We left immediately, hearts hammering. But that night, back at another campsite, things escalated. It began with whispers again, soft, curling around the tent. Then scratching, not just on the tent, but underneath, as if something were digging, trying to get in. Max and Ruby went berserk, barking like I'd never heard. Then the screaming started. Not a normal animal scream, not human either, but a high, piercing wail that seemed to echo from every direction at once. It lasted for hours. Mark and I didn't sleep. We huddled together in the car, rocking slightly, whispering prayers, telling each other it was a storm or a coyote pack. But the sound didn't make sense. It had intelligence, malice, purpose. By the third day, we were exhausted, paranoid. We tried to leave the park altogether, stick to main roads, and get back to civilization. The roads seemed longer, the GPS failing again, sending us in loops. Every turn felt wrong. Every shadow in the trees seemed to move in ways that defied logic. That night, while parked at a small motel on the outskirts of Gatlinburg, the nightmare came close to real violence. I woke to the sound of someone pounding on the car roof. Heavy, rhythmic, and deliberate. Mark was asleep, snoring softly. I grabbed the flashlight and shined it through the window. Outside, the parking lot was empty except for faint footprints pressed into the soft mud, leading toward the woods, and then vanishing. The pounding started again, more insistent. I shook Mark awake. He groaned, rubbed his eyes, and muttered something about a storm. "There's no storm," I said, voice shaking. "Someone's here. I know it." We spent the night in a panic. Dogs pressed against us, doors locked, lights on. We didn't sleep. By morning, the parking lot looked normal. No sign of anyone, just empty asphalt and the fading traces of tire marks. The final horror came on the drive home. We stuck to the interstate, daylight burning down, safe in our sense of civilization. But every few miles, we saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the woods, always just out of reach, pale, thin, watching us. Not moving, not running, just waiting. Sometimes it would vanish before we could blink, only to appear again a few miles down the road. I didn't speak much. Mark didn't either. Max and Ruby barked, lunged, growled, refusing to settle. By the time we crossed back into Kentucky, the figure stopped appearing. We made it home, exhausted, traumatized, but alive. I never went back to those roads, never even looked at pictures of the Great Smoky Mountains without shivering. We told ourselves it was some combination of exhaustion, isolation, and imagination, but I never told anyone the whole truth. The whispers, the taps, the wailing. I couldn't. Sometimes late at night, when I drive alone, I see the figure at the edge of the woods. Pale, thin, just standing, watching, waiting. And I know somehow it remembers me. And I remember the cold, sinking feeling that whatever it is, it doesn't forget. Story the end. It started as a simple road trip. Ryan and his friends, Mark, Jenna, and Claire, were all recent college graduates, looking to squeeze one last adventure into their summer before reality hit them with jobs, bills, and responsibilities. Their plan was straightforward. Drive from Chicago to the Smoky Mountains in Tennessee, camp for a few days, and return with stories to share over beers and campfires. They had the route mapped out, reservations made for the first night in a small motel along Route 60, and an old Jeep packed with supplies, tents, sleeping bags, cooler full of food, and enough snacks to last a week. What none of them realized was that this trip would take a dark turn, the kind of turn that makes you question whether some roads are meant to be traveled at all. They left Chicago in the late afternoon, the city lights fading as they merged onto the highway. The first few hours were uneventful, filled with laughter, loud music, and the occasional retelling of old college stories. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of orange and red, the mood started to shift subtly. The highway narrowed, the roadside signs became sparser, and the few other vehicles on the road seemed distant, almost like ghosts drifting past them. Ryan, driving, cracked a joke about ghost drivers on a lonely road, but his voice sounded hollow in the Jeep, and nobody laughed. Around 10 p.m., they decided to take a break at a rest area. The place was deserted, except for one old gas station that looked like it had been abandoned decades ago. They pulled in, and the building creaked in the wind. Jenna swore she saw a shadow move behind the cracked windows, but when she pointed it out, the others shrugged it off. Claire, the most cautious of the group, suggested they stick to the car and grab whatever snacks they had in the cooler instead of venturing inside. They agreed, though uneasily. As they got back on the road, the radio started cutting in and out, static filling the cabin, sometimes with faint, indecipherable voices layered underneath. Mark laughed nervously, fiddling with the dial, but the interference wouldn't go away. It was almost as if someone, or something, was trying to speak through the static. By midnight, they were far from the main highway, taking a back road Ryan had found on an old travel forum. It was narrower, surrounded by dense forest, the kind of place that made headlights barely enough to illuminate more than 10 feet ahead. Claire kept glancing at her phone, worried about losing signal, and sure enough, the bar for service slowly dwindled until it disappeared completely. Jenna joked that they were in the dead zone, but her voice lacked the usual energy. It had an edge of nervousness. They pressed on, telling themselves that the road would eventually meet Route 441 near the Smokies. It was after 1 a.m. when the Jeep suddenly jerked, throwing everyone forward. Ryan slammed the brakes, heart pounding, and they realized the vehicle had hit something. Mark grabbed a flashlight and went outside to inspect, only to return shaking. There's nothing there, just fog, thick fog. And these tracks, big tracks, like someone's walking along the road. The others stared at him, uneasy. The fog was strange, unnaturally thick for a summer night, curling along the ground and rising around the Jeep like it had a will of its own. They decided to keep moving, reasoning it was just a dense mist and their minds were playing tricks on them. 20 minutes later, they saw a faint light ahead, a lone cabin, appearing almost out of nowhere. It wasn't marked on any map, and it didn't look like any of the vacation rentals Ryan had scouted. But the idea of stopping somewhere familiar, even just to check if anyone was there, was tempting. They parked a short distance from the cabin, noting that it looked abandoned, windows boarded, roof sagging, door barely hanging on its hinges. Claire was immediately against it. We shouldn't go in. It doesn't feel right. But curiosity got the better of them, and Ryan led the way. The cabin smelled of rot and mildew. The floorboards creaked under their weight, and the air was unnaturally cold, even in the humid summer night. Mark found a staircase leading down into what looked like a basement and insisted on checking it. The four of them hesitated at the top of the stairs. Jenna whispered, "I think we should just leave," but Ryan muttered something about checking it quickly and going back to the car. One by one, they descended, flashlight beams cutting through the thick darkness. The basement was small and cluttered, shelves lined with rusted tools and jars filled with unidentifiable substances. In the corner, a large black stain on the floor caught their attention. It looked old, but fresh enough to make their stomachs churn. Claire gagged, "We need to leave. Now." Suddenly, a low hum filled the basement, vibrating through the walls. The four of them froze. It wasn't coming from outside, nor from the Jeep. It was internal, deep within the cabin. The hum turned into whispers, soft but insistent, repeating phrases they couldn't understand. Panic set in, and they bolted upstairs. As they rushed out, Ryan swore he saw a figure at the top of the stairs, a shadowy shape, hunched, watching them. But when they turned the flashlight back, it was gone. They scrambled back into the Jeep, and Ryan slammed it into reverse, tires spinning on the gravel as they tore away. The road behind them seemed to stretch endlessly, fog clinging to the headlights like liquid. The whispers followed them, faint but constant, and Claire insisted she saw figures in the tree line, moving just beyond the reach of the lights. Mark tried to calm everyone, saying it was exhaustion and paranoia, but Jenna, crying softly, whispered, "They're following us." By 2:30 a.m., the fog started thinning, and the highway finally reappeared. Relief was short-lived. They passed mile marker 112, a section of road that had been the site of multiple car accidents over the years, according to Ryan's research. The stories of ghosts haunting drivers were just urban legends, he reminded himself, though his voice trembled. That's when a shadowy figure darted across the road, and Ryan swerved violently, hitting the guardrail. The Jeep spun, and the engine stalled. Panic set in again as they realized their phones were still dead, and the nearest help was miles away. Out of the darkness, a lone figure appeared, tall, wearing tattered clothing that seemed soaked in mud or worse. Its face was obscured, but the silhouette radiated a malice that was palpable. Ryan locked the doors, and the figure stopped at the side of the road, tilting its head as if studying them. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished into the night. None of them spoke for several minutes, all of them staring out the windows, expecting it to return. But when it didn't, Ryan managed to start the Jeep and drive the rest of the way to the next town, a tiny cluster of gas stations and motels. They spent the night in a cheap motel, doors locked, lights on, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. Claire had trouble sleeping, muttering about the cabin and the figures in the trees. Mark and Jenna tried to joke about the situation, but their laughter sounded forced, brittle. Ryan couldn't stop thinking about the figure on the road and the hum in the basement, and he realized that no matter how much he told himself it was a trick of the mind, he would never see the Smokies in the same way again. The next morning, they continued their journey, hoping that daylight would wash away the memories of the night. The roads seemed normal now, the fog gone, and the air warmer. They reached the entrance to the Smoky Mountains National Park around noon. Paying the entrance fee and driving deeper into the winding roads, the trees dense but comforting in a way that reminded them of maps and travel guides. They set up camp at a designated site and tried to shake off the previous night. The sounds of wildlife, children laughing in the distance, and rustling leaves should have calmed them. But there was a sense of unease, a persistent feeling that something unseen was observing them. That night, around 11 p.m., they gathered around the campfire, trying to make jokes, roast marshmallows, and pretend nothing had happened. But when they heard a knock from outside the circle of firelight, their hearts sank. They all froze, looking toward the sound. There was nothing, no bear, no animal, just the darkness. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a scraping sound, like claws on bark. Ryan whispered for everyone to stay quiet. The sound moved around the perimeter of the campsite, never getting closer, never retreating either. Then a faint whisper, almost human, almost pleading, came from the trees. Go, go. Terrified, they packed up quickly, deciding to leave the park at dawn. As they drove out, the roads twisted strangely, almost as if the landscape had changed overnight. Familiar landmarks didn't match the maps, and soon they found themselves on another back road, far from the main route. The fog returned, this time thicker, almost alive, curling around the Jeep like fingers trying to drag them back. Ryan's eyes were dry, staring at the road, but he couldn't see anything clearly. Mark clutched the seat, silent, and Jenna's muffled sobs filled the cabin. Claire kept repeating, "We're never getting out. We're never getting out." Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time felt warped, distorted. The Jeep ran out of gas at some point, leaving them stranded in the middle of nowhere. They tried to call for help again. Phones dead, radio static, nothing. Then in the distance, lights flickered, just enough to make them think salvation had arrived. They trudged toward it on foot, stumbling over roots and uneven ground. The lights led them to a building that looked like a gas station, but when they reached it, it was completely dark, abandoned, dust-covered, and decaying. No one inside. No signs of life, just the faint hum again and the unmistakable feeling of being watched. Panic turned to desperation. They ran back to the Jeep, only to see footprints leading away in the fog, enormous, too large for any human, trailing into the forest. Shadows moved between the trees, darting, always just out of sight. They climbed into the Jeep, locked the doors, and decided to wait for dawn. Hours passed, the fog never lifting. Whispers, knocks, and movements haunted the periphery of their vision. Each of them sat frozen, too terrified to speak, hoping morning would bring an escape that didn't come. When the sun finally broke through the dense fog, they found themselves on a small, rural road. Confused, they realized they were no longer in the Smokies, but somewhere unfamiliar, the kind of place that looked forgotten by time. An old highway sign indicated they were on Route 84, hundreds of miles from where they thought they had been. They drove cautiously, trying to reach a town. Hours later, they found a diner. The smell of fried food and coffee felt surreal, almost comforting. Inside, the locals stared at them oddly, as if expecting something, or someone. Ryan asked for directions back to Chicago. The waitress smiled faintly, pointing vaguely south. "You've got a long drive," she said. Nothing more. They drove. Days passed, and the Jeep carried them through winding roads, countless towns, and miles of forest. But something was off. Every highway sign seemed unfamiliar. Every town looked deserted. Gas stations were empty, motels had no vacancy signs even in the middle of the afternoon. Occasionally they saw figures at the roadside, always watching, never approaching. By the fifth day, tension had turned to paranoia. The group rarely spoke, exhausted, hungry, and drained. Eventually they came upon a main interstate. Relief washed over them as they merged onto it, thinking finally they could navigate back to Chicago. The night brought back the fog, the whispers, and the figures. Ryan's driving became erratic, and the group realized that no matter how far they went, something was following, something relentless. Every time they stopped, shadows flitted just out of reach. Every time they slept, they awoke to the feeling of eyes on them. The Jeep seemed to move on its own at times, pulling slightly toward the trees, toward the darkness they couldn't escape. Weeks passed, or maybe a few days. Time lost meaning. Gas stations and diners became rare, and when they appeared, they were empty. The group started seeing the same abandoned cabin from the first night, over and over in different places. Each sighting was accompanied by the low hum, the whispers, the sense that something wanted them back. They began to notice scratches on the Jeep, deep, raw marks, as if something had tried to claw its way inside. At night, the whispers got louder, more insistent. They tried leaving the vehicle, walking into towns for help, but each time they returned, the Jeep was waiting, the marks deeper, the shadows closer. Eventually, the group became fractured, mentally and emotionally. Mark stopped talking entirely, staring out the window, twitching at every shadow. Jenna would scream at night, thrashing, convinced figures were in the car. Claire refused to sleep, constantly pacing and whispering prayers. Ryan drove continuously, barely stopping, driven by a mix of terror and stubborn hope. Every road looked the same, every town felt like a trap. The feeling that they were being hunted never left them. The air itself seemed hostile. One evening, they arrived at another roadside motel, the kind with flickering neon signs and peeling paint. Desperate for rest, they checked in. The room smelled of mildew and something worse, something metallic like blood. Ryan fell asleep instantly, exhaustion overtaking fear. Claire stayed awake, watching shadows dance on the walls. Around 3 a.m., a knock came at the door. Not a soft knock, rapid, urgent. Jenna whimpered. Claire whispered, "Don't open it." Ryan stirred, half asleep, and went to the door, but before he could unlock it, the lights flickered and went out. The knocking stopped. Silence. Then the whispers started again, louder than ever. Words formed, unmistakable now. "You can't leave. You never leave." By morning, the Jeep was gone from the parking lot. The four friends were still in the motel room, the door unlocked, no signs of forced entry. Outside, the town seemed completely empty. They walked through the streets, hoping to find the Jeep or any sign of life. There was none, just fog rolling in, whispers on the wind, and shadows that shifted at the corner of their vision. They realized, finally, that the world they had entered was not the one they knew. Roads twisted endlessly, towns appeared and vanished, and time itself was warped. Their attempt at a simple road trip had trapped them in a liminal space, a purgatory of fog, shadows, and whispers. Years later, travelers would tell stories about a Jeep full of young people disappearing somewhere between Chicago and the Smoky Mountains, a road trip that ended in legend. Some claimed to see the Jeep on certain foggy nights, headlights flickering in the distance, moving along a highway that shouldn't exist. They say the occupants are still inside, driving endlessly, never aging, always chased by shadows, whispers, and a cabin that appears in the fog, calling them back. Those who encountered the Jeep spoke of the air turning cold, a low hum in their ears, and the chilling sensation of being watched. No one who saw it ever spoke of it again, at least not without fear. The four friends never returned. Their phones, their names, their very existence gradually faded from records, as if the world itself had decided to forget them. Some nights, when fog rolls in thick over forgotten back roads in Tennessee, motorists swear they see headlights, hear whispers, and glimpse figures in the tree line, figures that watch and wait, just beyond reach. They say the Jeep is still driving, endlessly pursued by something ancient, something patient, something that never lets go. And if you follow the road too far, through the fog and the shadows, you might just see the cabin yourself, hear the hum, and know too late that some roads are never meant to be traveled. Story the end. It started out like any other road trip. I was 27, freshly out of college, and craving the kind of freedom that only comes with a car, a map, and no real schedule. My plan was simple: drive from Boston to San Francisco over the course of 2 weeks, taking the less traveled routes whenever possible. I had always loved the quiet beauty of America's back roads, the rolling hills, the long stretches of desert, the tiny towns that seemed stuck in the past. I wanted to see it all firsthand, take photos, and maybe stumble upon a story worth telling. I left Boston early one morning in July. The air was warm and humid, the kind that sticks to your skin and smells faintly of asphalt and greenery. My car was packed with essentials: a backpack, camera, snacks, and a cooler with a few days' worth of food. The highway out of the city was predictable: cars, trucks, honking horns. But as I moved further into the countryside, traffic thinned and the landscape opened. I passed through rolling hills, dense forests, and abandoned farmhouses that looked like they'd been forgotten decades ago. The first night, I stopped in a small town in New Hampshire. It was quiet, the kind of town where everyone looked at you when you walked past. I found a motel on the edge of town, a small building with peeling paint and flickering neon that read Pine Haven Inn. The clerk was a middle-aged woman who didn't smile much. She handed me the key without looking up from the ledger. My room smelled faintly of mildew and old carpet, but I didn't mind. I was exhausted and fell asleep almost immediately. That night, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside my door, light, deliberate, pacing back and forth. I told myself it was just the old building settling, or maybe someone else staying in the motel, but the feeling of being watched gnawed at me. I tried to sleep again, but every creak of the floorboards made me tense. By dawn, I was too nervous to linger. I left quickly, trying to shake off the unease. Driving through Vermont and into New York, I stuck mostly to smaller roads. The GPS signal faded in and out, and cell service was spotty at best. I passed through towns that looked as though they'd been frozen in time, with diners that had vinyl booths and soda machines that hissed. I stopped at a diner in upstate New York, where the waitress gave me a strange look when I asked about a motel nearby. "There's one a few miles down the road," she said slowly, "but people say strange things happen there." I laughed nervously, thinking she meant drunk teenagers or a power outage. That motel turned out to be exactly as she described: quiet, with creaking floors and an eerie stillness. I barely slept that night. I kept hearing what sounded like whispers in the hallway, faint voices calling my name. When I got up to check, the hallway was empty. The unease followed me into the next morning, but I pushed it aside and continued my journey west. By the time I reached Pennsylvania, the heat of July had intensified and the landscape became flatter, more open. I enjoyed driving through farmland, stopping occasionally to photograph old barns and silos. Around midday, I pulled off onto a dirt road leading to a small abandoned town I'd read about online. It was supposed to be deserted, a remnant of the coal mining days. The road was narrow, lined with tall grass, and I felt an immediate sense of isolation as I drove further in. When I arrived, the town was eerily quiet. Wooden buildings leaned at odd angles, windows shattered or boarded up. The main street was cracked and overgrown. I parked my car and started exploring, taking photographs of the decaying structures. As I approached the old general store, I heard a faint whisper, almost imperceptible: "Leave." I froze. My rational mind told me it was the wind, but the chill crawling up my spine suggested otherwise. I looked around. No one was there. I continued cautiously, moving toward the old railway station at the edge of town. The tracks were rusted, the platform rotting. Then I saw a figure standing at the far end of the platform. Tall, thin, hunched slightly, wearing tattered clothing. I squinted, trying to make sense of it. When I raised my camera to take a picture, the figure didn't move. When the flash went off, it was gone. No footprints, no trace, nothing. My stomach turned. I hurried back to my car and drove off the dirt road, the sense of being watched never leaving me. The following night, I stopped at a small motel in Ohio. The clerk there was young, polite, but his eyes darted nervously when I asked about the surrounding area. "Not much to see around here," he said. "Mostly back roads and farmland. Some people don't like strangers wandering too far." I thanked him and went to my room. That night, I barely slept again. The walls seemed too thin. I could hear whispers, soft and deliberate, even though I knew the motel was nearly empty. By the time I reached Indiana, the days were long and the nights felt even longer. I drove through stretches of open road where the horizon seemed endless. Around dusk, I stopped at a rest area to stretch my legs. An older man sat on a bench, staring at the trees. When I passed, he nodded slightly, muttering something I didn't catch. Something about the way he smiled felt wrong, too deliberate, almost unnatural. That night, I stayed at a motel on the outskirts of a tiny town in Illinois. It was the kind of place where you could hear every footstep in the hall. I kept thinking about the man on the bench, the figure at the railway station, the whispers in the motels. The air seemed heavier, the shadows darker. I locked the door, kept a chair under the doorknob, and still couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was outside, waiting. The next day, I drove into Missouri. The landscape was rolling hills, forests, and more abandoned farms. I decided to take a detour to a lake I'd read about online, supposedly a hidden gem. The directions led me down a narrow dirt road, past fields of corn and wheat. As I drove, the GPS signal disappeared entirely, and the road seemed to stretch longer than it should. I passed an old farmhouse, windows boarded, and for a brief second, I thought I saw movement inside. I shook my head, blaming my imagination. By late afternoon, I reached the lake. It was beautiful, serene, the water reflecting the deep blue sky. I parked and walked along the shore, trying to calm myself. Then I saw footprints in the sand, fresh, leading from the tree line to the water and back again. I was alone, or at least I thought I was. My heart raced. I followed the footprints, but they ended abruptly, as if the person had vanished into thin air. That night, I stayed at a small motel in Kansas. The clerk, a middle-aged woman, gave me a key and muttered something under her breath. I didn't catch it, but the unease was familiar. My room felt colder than usual. I lay in bed, listening to the sounds of the wind outside, imagining footsteps approaching. Sleep did not come easily. The next morning, I continued west, heading into Colorado. The landscape shifted dramatically. Flat plains gave way to hills, then pine forests. I stopped along a quiet road to photograph the sunset over a ridge. As I crouched to adjust my camera, I realized my car keys were missing. My heart jumped. I checked my pockets, the ground, the car itself. Nothing. Panic surged. Then I heard footsteps, crunching through pine needles, moving toward me. I turned slowly, and there it was, the tall, thin figure, moving deliberately, silently. I froze. It didn't speak, didn't move unnaturally, just observed. I slammed the car door, locked it, and started the engine. The figure didn't disappear, but it stayed at the edge of my headlights until I drove away. I drove all night, unsure of where I was heading, desperate to reach civilization. The hours blurred together. Every shadow, every sound, every movement in the darkness set my nerves on edge. By dawn, I reached Denver. Relief washed over me as I navigated the city streets, filled with cars and people. I parked and sat for a long time, trying to calm myself, telling myself it had all been imagination, exhaustion, the isolation playing tricks on my mind. But when I reviewed the photos from my trip, my stomach dropped. Figures appeared in the images, shadowy, distorted, impossible, but unmistakably there. In some, the tall, thin figure was closer, always just beyond reach, always watching. Even now, years later, when I drive past open fields or abandoned buildings, I feel the same prickling sense of being watched. And sometimes when I look at those old photographs, I swear I can see them waiting, just beyond the frame, ready for the next traveler, foolish enough to stray too far from the road. Story the end. It was late October when I decided to take a trip down to the Ozarks. I had always wanted to explore the back roads and small towns tucked away in the mountains, far from the highways and tourist traps. My plan was simple: drive, see some scenery, maybe camp if I found a quiet spot, and return after a few days. I packed my car the night before: sleeping bag, food, water, a first aid kit, and a flashlight, because I had learned to never rely solely on my phone in remote areas. I left Chicago in the early morning, the sun barely peeking over the skyline, and drove south on I-55. The day started normal enough. The highways were busy but manageable, and I found myself enjoying the solitude of the long drive, the quiet hum of the tires over asphalt, a kind of comforting rhythm. After several hours, I exited the highway and started on smaller roads, following the GPS toward a town called Jasper. The scenery changed quickly. Tall, dense trees flanked the road, their branches intertwining overhead, forming a tunnel of shadows even under the bright afternoon sun. The traffic thinned to almost nothing. I passed a few farmhouses, mostly abandoned, their windows dark and broken. Something about the quiet out here felt heavier than just the absence of cars, like the air itself had weight pressing down. I shook off the unease and kept driving. The first warning sign came as I passed a sign indicating a dead-end road that led to a place called Hollow Creek. The road wasn't on my map, but curiosity got the better of me. It was narrow, paved unevenly, and flanked on both sides by thick woods. As I drove, the sun dipped lower, and the shadows from the trees stretched across the road. I could barely see the asphalt beneath my tires, and the forest seemed unnaturally still. No birds, no wind, just a heavy, suffocating silence. I tried to tell myself it was just the remoteness, that small towns and backroads often felt deserted. Then I saw the first figure, a man, tall, thin, wearing dark clothes, stood at the edge of the road about 50 yards ahead. He didn't wave, didn't move, just stared at me. His face was pale and obscured by shadows, and I couldn't make out any features. My stomach knotted. I slowed, expecting him to step aside, but he didn't. Instead, he raised his hand in a slow, yet deliberate motion pointing toward the woods. I shook my head, muttering that I wasn't stopping for anything, and accelerated past him, heart pounding. When I glanced in the rearview mirror, he was gone. I laughed nervously, telling myself I was imagining things, maybe a trick of the trees or my own exhaustion. The road twisted sharply, and I noticed the sun had dipped below the horizon. The sky was turning a dark indigo, and I realized I was still deep in the forest, with no clear idea of how far I was from civilization. My phone had no signal. My headlights barely penetrated the dense darkness, and every bend seemed to reveal more shadows lurking just at the edge of the beam. Then I heard the first sound. Not from the woods, but from inside my car. Or at least, it seemed that way at first. A soft tapping, like fingernails lightly drumming against the roof. I glanced around, nothing but the car and the road. I dismissed it as a branch brushing against the car, or maybe an animal, but then it came again, louder, and this time from the passenger side. I swerved slightly, heart racing, and the sound stopped. I told myself to breathe, tried to focus on the road, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving just beyond the edge of my headlights. I pushed on, desperate to reach some sign of life. About 20 minutes later, I saw a faint glow through the trees, a small gas station or convenience store. Relief flooded me. I pulled in, but the building was empty. No lights, no sign of activity, and the doors were locked. I circled the building, hoping maybe the clerk had stepped out for a break, but the parking lot was deserted, and a faded sign advertised fuel prices that hadn't been updated in years. Unease settled deep in my chest. Something about this place felt wrong. Not just abandoned, but alive in a way I couldn't explain. I got back in the car, trying to shake it off. I needed to find a motel, a town, anything. My GPS indicated a place called Red Pine, a small settlement a few miles ahead. The road narrowed further, and the trees pressed in closer. My headlights caught glimpses of shapes moving in the shadows, first one, then another. I kept telling myself it was deer, or maybe a pair of hunters, but the shapes moved differently. They didn't run when I approached, didn't scatter, just kept pace with the car at the edge of visibility. My pulse hammered in my ears. Then I saw it clearly, a figure standing directly in the middle of the road, pale and impossibly still. Its head tilted slightly, as if it were watching me. I slammed on the brakes, tires screeching, and the figure didn't move. I backed up, heart in my throat, and it didn't flinch. My flashlight, which I had taken out in desperation, illuminated the figure as I rolled the window down, and I swear its face, featureless, blank, pressed into my memory in a way I couldn't unsee. I floored the accelerator, swerving around it. When I looked in the rearview mirror, I realized I wasn't alone anymore. Dozens of figures had emerged from the trees, their movements slow, deliberate, surrounding the car, keeping pace with me. I tried to convince myself it was some optical illusion, maybe shadows stretched by fog and moonlight, but I knew better. I could feel their attention, their presence pressing in. My hands shook on the steering wheel. I drove faster, gripping the wheel like my life depended on it, and the forest seemed to stretch endlessly before me. Hours, or maybe minutes, it was impossible to tell, passed in a blur of winding roads and figures at the edge of vision. Exhaustion and fear tangled in my chest. Then I saw lights ahead, faint, flickering like candle flames. Hope surged. I drove toward them, desperate for safety. It was a motel, isolated, small, and the neon sign flickered weakly. Vacancy. Relief mixed with apprehension. I pulled into the lot, but something felt off. The building looked old, abandoned, and yet somehow freshly used. Doors were slightly ajar, as if inviting me in. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out. The air smelled damp, wood rotting. I walked to the lobby. It was empty. Dust covered the counters, and the bell at the reception was tarnished. I called out, but my voice was swallowed by the emptiness. I left the flashlight account on the counter and checked the rooms. Each was small, cold, and smelled like decay. Mirrors hung on the walls, reflecting dim light. I noticed something strange in the glass, a shadow that didn't belong to me, shifting in the corner of the room. I froze. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. Fatigue, stress, paranoia, but the shadow moved independently of the light. I spun around. Nothing. The shadow was gone, then reappeared in the mirror, closer, darker. I backed away until my back hit the wall. Then came the footsteps. Soft at first, slow, deliberate, descending from the floor above. I held my breath. They grew louder, heavier, like someone or something was moving toward me. I tried to open the door, but it was stuck. Windows didn't budge. The hallway seemed to stretch impossibly, doors looping back into the same rooms. I ran down the hall, adrenaline fueling my flight. Shadows followed me, pooling in corners, stretching across floors, walls, ceilings. The mirrors multiplied them, every reflection showing more figures than actually existed. I tried to call for help, but my phone had no signal. The motel itself seemed to pulse with life, corridors looping endlessly, trapping me. Exhaustion overtook me. I collapsed in one room, flashlight clutched to my chest, shadows pressing in. I saw one figure at the far end of the room, taller, darker, faceless. Its presence radiated intent, focus. It stepped closer and I felt my mind flicker, memories unraveling. I don't know how long I remained in that state. Time seemed meaningless. But then the first light of dawn, or what I thought was dawn, spilled through the windows. The doors were open. The motel lot was empty except for my car. I ran, got in, started the engine, and didn't look back. The road opened up to familiar highways, towns I recognized. I passed through Mill Hollow again, and it looked normal now, almost mundane. No figures, no dragging sounds, nothing. But the memories didn't leave. Even now, years later, when I drive alone late at night, I see shadows at the edge of the road. I feel the same weight, the same pressure, the same gaze. I never take back roads at night anymore. I avoid the forested routes entirely. But part of me knows that what I experienced wasn't just a nightmare or a trick of the mind. Some part of that forest, that motel, that hollow creek is still out there, waiting for the next traveler foolish enough to wander too far from the road. Story, the end. It was a late September afternoon when I decided to take a road trip across the Midwest. I had always loved the idea of driving alone, windows down, music loud, miles stretching out in front of me, with nothing but the hum of the engine and the occasional gas station coffee. I was coming from Chicago, planning to make my way through Iowa, then down to Missouri before swinging back east. It was supposed to be simple: 3 weeks, a tent, a few motels, and me, the open road, and maybe a couple of diners along the way. But what actually happened on that trip became something I've never been able to shake. The first day was uneventful. Highways stretching endlessly, fields of corn swaying in the wind, small towns that seemed frozen in time. I stopped in one town called Harper, Iowa, mainly because it was on the map and had a decent-looking diner. I remember walking in and feeling the weight of quiet, like the entire place was watching me. No music, just the occasional clink of silverware and a TV playing the local news. The waitress was older, gray-haired, smiling politely, but not much more. I ordered the breakfast special, even though it was past lunch, coffee black, eggs over easy. She brought it, muttering something about safe travels, but there was an edge in her tone I didn't catch until later. After Harper, I got back on the road, heading toward a smaller route the GPS said would save me about 30 minutes. The sun was dropping, and suddenly the fields were replaced by dense woods. I'd driven rural roads before, but this was different. The trees were old, knotted, and so close together it felt like the canopy was pressing down on the car. I kept the speed low, trying not to get spooked. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every few minutes, I thought I saw movement at the tree line. Shapes that didn't make sense, like figures crouched or kneeling, watching me pass. I told myself it was the shadows, the light, the tricks of a tired mind. Eventually, the road started to narrow. No markings, gravel, no signs except for a small one that read Cedarwood Lane. It was barely legible, old and worn. The GPS recalculated and kept insisting I turn, but the road seemed to go nowhere. Eventually, I had to stop because the car hit a rut that rattled the steering wheel violently. That's when I noticed it. A house, far off the road, partly hidden by trees, darkened windows, roof sagging. I thought it abandoned. It looked like one of those old farmhouses that had been left to rot. But then I saw movement in one of the windows, a dark silhouette shifting, disappearing when I blinked. I laughed nervously at myself. Maybe I'd driven too far into the sticks. Maybe it was just an animal. I told myself I'd just keep moving, get to a better road before it got too dark. But darkness came faster than I expected, and soon I was driving with only my headlights cutting a narrow path through the trees. The car felt heavy, like it was resisting me. Maybe it was just my imagination, exhaustion, or the strange energy of the area. Either way, the hairs on my neck were standing up. That's when the car died. No sputtering, no warning, just nothing. The lights flickered, the engine whined once, then silence. I tried to restart it, all the while scanning the trees with my high beams. No cars, no lights. No signs of anyone else. I grabbed my phone, no service, not even one bar. My heart began to thump in a way that I could feel in my throat. I had driven this road alone into the middle of nowhere, and now I was stranded. I stepped out of the car, flashlight in hand. The air was thick and cold. There was a faint rustling in the trees. I called out. Nothing. I tried to stay calm. There had to be a solution. A house, a person, something. That's when I saw another figure. Not in the trees. On the road, further ahead, standing perfectly still. I couldn't make out any features, only the outline of a person, or something shaped like a person. I waved my flashlight. The figure didn't move. I called out again. Silence. I got the sense it was waiting, watching. I didn't know what came over me, but I started walking toward the figure. Maybe it was someone who could help. Maybe it was a house nearby. The road twisted and dipped, and with each step, the figure didn't seem closer, only the same distance away. That's when I heard the whispers. Low, almost inaudible, carried on the wind, coming from the direction of the trees. I froze, listening. They weren't speaking words I could understand, just fragmented sounds, almost like someone breathing through a cloth or reciting numbers. Then, a sudden, sharp crack, like a branch snapping, and the figure vanished. Panic set in. I turned and ran back toward the car, back tripping over roots and stones, heart hammering, breath ragged. When I got back, the car was different. Not in a physical sense, but somehow altered, like it was waiting for me in a new way. I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life. I didn't question it. I sped off, not looking back. The road opened up after a while, back to gravel, then paved, then finally a main road. I thought I was safe, but the feeling didn't leave me. Every mirror in my car reflected shadows in ways that weren't natural. The high beams sometimes caught glimpses of movement, but when I turned, there was nothing. The whispers had followed me too, always faint, always at the edge of perception. Later that night, I stopped at a motel in a tiny town in Missouri. The neon sign flickered, the paint peeled, the smell of stale cigarette smoke in the lobby. I asked for a room. The woman at the front desk, late 40s, hair pulled back, tired eyes, looked at me for longer than necessary before handing me the key. Room 6, she said softly. Don't go out back. I chuckled nervously. I won't. She didn't smile. The room was cheap, like motels always are. Thin walls, sagging mattress, buzzing fluorescent light. I showered, tried to eat a granola bar, but sleep didn't come. I kept hearing sounds, the creak of floorboards, the whisper of wind. I swear I thought I saw someone outside my window, watching, then ducking out of sight. I didn't sleep that night. I barely closed my eyes. The next day, I went to a diner for breakfast. I needed coffee. I told the waitress my route, joking about driving through nowhere. She stared at me. "You were on Cedarwood Lane, weren't you?" I nodded, laughing awkwardly. "Yeah. Why?" Her eyes went cold. "Nobody's been out there for decades. The house, the people, they vanished one night. The road was closed after that. You shouldn't have been there." I laughed, nervously, telling her she was exaggerating. But inside, I knew she wasn't. The unease, the shadows, the whispers, they weren't in my head. Something had followed me, and I had no idea how or why. As I drove onward, I kept my speed high, lights on, eyes constantly scanning. The road signs seemed off. I would pass the same marker twice in a short span, or see a bend in the road I didn't remember. Sometimes I'd glimpse a figure at the edge of the trees, thin, impossibly long-limbed, disappearing when I blinked. By the time I crossed into Missouri fully, I was on edge. The woods had thinned into plains, small towns sprinkled along the highway. I stayed in motels, never camping, never stopping after dark. Every reflection in my mirrors had shadows. Every night I heard footsteps outside the room. Every diner, every gas station, every person I passed had a strange way of looking at me, like they knew something I didn't. 2 weeks into the trip, I pulled into a small town, sleepy, surrounded by cornfields. I checked in at a motel. The front desk had a map. I noticed something that made my stomach twist. Cedarwood Lane was marked, but it didn't connect to any road. It was a dead line on the map, ending abruptly in the middle of the woods. I knew then that the road I had driven wasn't supposed to exist, and neither was the house. That night I didn't sleep. I stayed awake, listening. The wind howled differently than usual, carrying faint, distorted laughter. I thought I saw movement in the parking lot, but the blinds were closed. I kept the lights on, the door locked, but I knew something was outside. Watching. Waiting. The final night of the trip, I decided to drive straight home, no stops, no detours. I left before dawn. Hours passed. I tried to shake off the lingering unease, telling myself it was over. But just outside St. Louis, in the middle of a highway stretch surrounded by nothing but fields and distant woods, I saw it. A figure standing on the side of the road, thin, twisted, unmoving. I swerved instinctively, heart hammering. When I looked again, it was gone. Since then, I've never traveled alone. I never camped. I never took small roads at night. And sometimes when I wake up, I hear faint whispers outside my window. Not words, just the sound of movement, counting, waiting. And I know, deep down, it hasn't ended. It's only a matter of time before it finds me again. Story, the end. It was one of those late summer evenings when the sun dips too quickly, leaving a strange glow over the horizon, and the highways seem emptier than they should be. My friend Kyle and I had decided to take a road trip from Minneapolis down to Nashville. It wasn't anything fancy. We were just two guys in our mid-20s looking to escape the monotony of cubicle life for a week. Kyle had picked the route, insisting that the back roads through Missouri and Arkansas were more scenic, though neither of us had considered what we'd be signing up for. The first 2 days went smoothly. We camped near Lake of the Ozarks, made a few bad attempts at fishing, and laughed at our lack of skills. It was on the third night, after driving nearly 12 hours, that things started feeling off. We were somewhere in the middle of northern Arkansas, somewhere that didn't seem to have a name on any of the maps we'd brought. The GPS had died hours ago. The phone signal was non-existent, and the sun had already set behind thick swaying trees that lined both sides of the road. Kyle was driving, his hands tight on the wheel, and I kept glancing out the passenger side window, half hoping to see a gas station or a town. Anything. But there was nothing. The road curved constantly, cutting through dense forest, the kind that made you feel like the trees themselves were pressing in on the asphalt. Then I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the road, illuminated briefly by our headlights. I blinked, and it was gone. "Kyle," I said, voice tight, "did you see that?" "See what?" he asked, eyes narrowing. "There was, I don't know, a person. I swear it was standing there." Kyle shook his head. "Must have been a deer or something. Let's keep moving." We drove on, but the feeling didn't leave me. There was something about that stretch of road that felt wrong, almost like it was holding its breath. Every so often, I'd catch shadows moving just at the edge of the light, and once I thought I saw the same figure again, farther down the road. After another 20 minutes, we came across a broken down truck on the shoulder. It was an old rusted Ford with a flat tire, doors swinging in the wind. There was no one around. Kyle slowed, but I urged him to keep going. "Let's just get past it," I said. He hesitated. "What if someone's out there needing help?" "I don't know, it just feels wrong." The truck was silent except for the creaking of the doors. Then, from behind the truck, a man stepped out. He looked normal at first, middle-aged, wearing a worn flannel shirt and jeans, but his face, there was something off. His eyes reflected the headlights in a way that made them look glassy, almost hollow. "Evening," he said. His voice was calm, almost friendly, but it didn't match the tension in the air. Kyle rolled down the window. "Everything okay? Need help with your truck?" The man shook his head slowly. "No, I'm fine. Just lost." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "Lost? On a road with no towns for miles?" I said, more sharply than I meant. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "These roads are tricky at night. You never know where they'll take you." We nodded awkwardly, and Kyle rolled the window up. The man waved briefly and disappeared back into the trees before we could react. We both said nothing for a while. The radio, which we'd been tuning aimlessly, started crackling as if static were trying to speak. Kyle cursed and tried to switch stations, but every channel had the same low, static-filled hum. Then, over the noise, a voice spoke. Not through the man's mouth, not through the truck, but through the static itself. "Turn back." I froze. Kyle slammed his hand on the radio. "It's probably some station interference," he said, though even he sounded uncertain. We didn't talk for a long time after that. The forest seemed to grow darker around us, the headlights cutting through an unnatural gloom. Eventually, we saw a faint glimmer of light ahead. Relief washed over me. We must be approaching a town, a motel, anything. The light turned out to be a small roadside diner. The neon sign flickered. "Open 24 hours," though the bulbs buzzed in a way that made the words almost unreadable. We pulled into the lot, which was cracked and overgrown with weeds. A single car sat at the far end, engine off, and no one moved inside. Inside, the diner smelled like stale coffee and old grease. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. An elderly woman stood behind the counter. She didn't greet us. She didn't even glance up. Hi?" Kyle said. "Are you open?" The woman's head tilted slightly, like she was listening for something only she could hear. Then she muttered, "Sit, order, leave." We exchanged glances, but sat in a booth near the window. The menu was typed on a sheet of paper, yellowed and curling at the edges. It listed things like burger, $3.50, fries, $1.50, and coffee, 75 cents. The prices seemed almost absurdly low, and the ink smudged as if it hadn't been printed in decades. We ordered. The coffee arrived first, lukewarm and bitter, with a faint metallic taste. Kyle stared into his cup. This tastes weird," he muttered. Before I could respond, the static voice came again. This time I could hear it clearly in my head, almost like an echo bouncing off the walls. "Don't trust her." I looked at Kyle. He didn't seem to hear it, but his eyes were wide, following the woman behind the counter. She moved with a slow, deliberate rhythm, pouring coffee for no one, wiping tables with ragged cloths. "I think we should leave," I whispered. Kyle nodded, though he kept glancing at the diner doors like he was reluctant to go. We paid quickly, leaving a few crumpled bills on the table, and stepped outside. The air had turned cold, the wind picking up in sudden gusts that seemed unnatural for a summer night. As we walked back to the car, we saw something in the parking lot. The car that had been there when we arrived was gone. In its place, a shadowy figure stood, watching us. It had the shape of a man, but it moved like smoke, flowing and shifting unnaturally. I froze. Kyle reached for the door handle. The figure didn't move closer, but its presence was suffocating. Then, in a sudden gust of wind, it vanished. We didn't talk about it until we were back on the road, the diner fading behind us. The GPS, which had been dead for hours, flickered to life. It showed a route to Nashville, but there was something strange. Several towns on the map were labeled with names like Hollow Creek, Dead Man's Junction, and Whispering Pines. They hadn't been there before. We drove on, our nerves frayed, listening to nothing but the hum of the car engine. Hours passed. We stopped only once at a rest area that smelled of mildew and something worse. A sign read, "Welcome to Grayson County," but every time I looked at it, it seemed to warp, the letters elongating and twisting as if reaching toward me. That night, we found a motel just off the highway. It looked normal from the road, neon vacancy sign, clean parking lot. But when we stepped inside, everything changed. The lobby was empty, and the air smelled of something metallic and stale. The clerk, a man with a crooked smile and two bright eyes, handed us a key without asking for ID. "You'll find the room fine," he said, voice too cheerful. "Sleep well." The room itself was wrong. The walls were too white, the carpet too soft, the bed too firm. When I lay down, I felt like the mattress was holding me in place, pressing against me in a way that was almost painful. Kyle fell asleep almost instantly, but I couldn't. Through the thin curtains, I saw shadows moving outside, circling the motel like vultures. And then, faint at first, I heard the whispers again, low and sibilant, coming from the vents, the walls, even the floor. They're coming. They're always coming. By morning, we were exhausted but relieved. Kyle suggested we skip Nashville and take the interstate home, a sensible choice. But as soon as we hit the road, the scenery became wrong again. The trees were too close, the sky too gray, the air thick, and the roads seemed to twist unnaturally, bending in ways that defied physics. We tried to call for help once, but every attempt failed. The car radio sputtered, and the GPS led us in circles to that same stretch of forest. And there in the headlights was the figure again, this time more distinct, a man, or something like a man, standing in the middle of the road. He raised a hand, and the road ahead dissolved, replaced by endless trees. Kyle slammed on the brakes. We stopped inches from him. The figure didn't move. I opened the door, intending to run, but Kyle grabbed me. "Don't!" Then the figure laughed. A hollow, echoing laugh that sounded like it came from everywhere at once. The road beneath us trembled, and the car shook violently. I felt my stomach drop as if the world itself was tipping sideways. And then, silence. We were back on the interstate. The sun was rising. The forest was gone. Everything looked normal. Kyle and I didn't speak for miles. When we finally made it to a gas station in rural Missouri, the radio played music again, and our phones worked. We never spoke of that night. We never tried that route again. But sometimes when I'm driving alone, I see it, shadows at the edge of the trees, a figure standing in the road that disappears when I blink. And remember the whispers, the diner, the motel, the endless roads twisting like a nightmare I couldn't wake from. I don't know what we saw out there in that stretch of Arkansas that shouldn't exist, but I know one thing. Some roads are meant to be avoided. Some travelers are never meant to return. And if you ever feel that quiet, heavy presence at the edge of the trees, heed it, turn back. Don't look too long, because whatever waits there, it's patient, and it never forgets. Story the end. It was a late October afternoon when I set out from Chicago on what I thought would be a routine road trip to Denver. I had the whole weekend mapped out. A few concerts, some hiking, maybe a night out in the city. I had driven long stretches before, but this time I wanted to take the back roads, the kind the GPS hesitated to suggest, the kind that promised scenery and solitude. My car was stocked with snacks, a tank full of gas, and an emergency kit just in case. I didn't think I'd need it. The first stretch was uneventful. Rolling farmland gave way to thick forests as I crossed into Iowa. The sun dipped lower, staining the sky a bruised orange, and I felt that familiar thrill of isolation that comes when civilization thins out and the only sounds are the hum of tires on asphalt and the occasional bird caw. I made a mental note to stop at a small diner I'd passed a few miles back. The sign was flickering, one of those old neon tubes struggling against age, but it called to me. I pulled in. Inside, the diner was nearly empty. The linoleum floor was scuffed, the counter sticky in places, and a ceiling fan spun lazily overhead. A middle-aged woman with frayed hair and a tired smile came over. "Just coffee?" she asked. I nodded. "Long drive?" she asked, filling the cup. I said yes, joking about the scenery. She didn't laugh, she just nodded, her eyes flicking toward the rear of the diner. I followed her gaze and noticed a man in a dark hoodie sitting alone at a booth, hands clasped on the table, staring at the floor. There was nothing overtly threatening about him, but something about the stillness felt off. I shook it off, chalking it up to road paranoia, and sipped my coffee. The woman returned with a slice of pie I hadn't ordered. "On the house," she said. I thanked her, but the man in the booth suddenly looked up. His eyes were sharp, too sharp, as if they could see straight through me. He didn't move or speak, just held my gaze, and a shiver ran down my spine. I finished quickly, left a tip, and got back in my car. As I drove off, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The man hadn't moved. He was still staring. The road stretched out, narrow and winding, flanked by trees that arched overhead like cathedral columns. Darkness fell faster than I expected, and the GPS started giving me recalculating warnings. The road was less traveled, more cracked, and bordered by a dense forest that seemed to close in with every mile. Then I saw it. Headlights in the distance, coming fast. I moved to the right side of the road to let the car pass, but it wasn't a single car. It was several, all too close together, moving in a staggered formation like a pack. As they neared, I realized there were no sounds of engines, only the glare of headlights reflecting off the asphalt. I slowed, uneasy, but my car seemed to hesitate, like it didn't want to respond. One of the vehicles swerved slightly, almost hitting the shoulder, but it never passed me. It simply followed, silently, keeping pace. I tried to take the next exit, but the road seemed to stretch on endlessly, like it had no intersections, no escape. My heart pounded, my hands gripping the wheel, and I told myself it was a hallucination, fatigue, some kind of optical illusion. But then I saw movement in the woods, shadows darting between the trees, impossibly fast, more than human. My car radio suddenly popped to life, static at first, then a garbled voice whispering my name. I slammed on the brakes. The voice stopped. For a long, unbearable minute, nothing moved except the car, and then I saw the man from the diner standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by my headlights. He was closer than he could have possibly gotten. I jerked the wheel, swerving into the dirt shoulder, tires skidding on loose gravel. He was gone. I kept driving, faster now, recklessly, praying for a town, any sign of civilization. I passed mile markers that made no sense, numbers, jumping, counting backward, then forward again. The road curved impossibly, creating a sense that I was trapped in a loop. Every time I looked in the rearview mirror, the pack of silent headlights had reappeared, tailing me, moving with uncanny coordination, never blinking, never yielding. By midnight, the roads were nearly invisible, the trees forming a tunnel over the asphalt, and I was running on fumes, literally. My phone had lost signal hours ago. Then I saw a gas station in the distance, a faint, flickering green glow. Relief washed over me, and I pulled in, praying the pumps would work. The station was abandoned. Shelves empty, lights flickering. A single pump stood operational, but as I reached for the nozzle, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was the man from the diner. But now he wasn't alone. Others appeared, their movements jerky, unnatural as if puppeted by invisible strings. Their faces were pale, eyes too wide, staring. One stepped forward and whispered, "You shouldn't be here." My stomach churned. I stumbled back to the car, fumbling with the keys. The figures didn't move closer. They just watched, swaying slightly as if caught in a wind I couldn't feel. I started the car, tires spinning on gravel, and I floored it. They didn't chase me at first. I thought I was safe. Then the radio crackled again, static first, then voices, hundreds of them, overlapping, whispering things I couldn't understand. The headlights returned, surrounding my car from all sides. Panic clawed at me. I could barely see the road. My vision tunneled, the trees looming like monsters. I hit the brakes again only to see the figures standing in the middle of the road, blocking my path entirely. And then the forest went silent. My car stopped, engine off, lights dimmed. I sat frozen, shaking, listening. Nothing moved. Then I saw it. A faint glimmer through the trees, a light warm and human, a house. I didn't hesitate. I ran toward it, tripping over roots, branches whipping my face. The house was small, rustic, seemingly abandoned, but a porch light flickered. I pounded on the door, screaming for help. It swung open. An elderly man stood there smiling. "You're lucky," he said. "Most don't make it this far." I asked what he meant. He didn't answer at first, just stepped aside, letting me in. Inside, the house was cozy, filled with the smell of burning wood and old books. He handed me a glass of water. "You'll be safe here," he said. "They don't cross this line." I drank, shaking. "Who are they?" I asked. "They're travelers," he said, "like you, lost ones. They follow. They never stop." I stayed the night, unable to sleep. The old man sat by the fireplace, staring into the flames. Occasionally, the shadows outside would shift, and I'd see them at the edge of the yard, those pale figures silent watching, but the light from the house seemed to keep them at bay. Morning came, gray and misty. I wanted to leave, but the old man stopped me. "You'll want to stay on the main road," he warned. "Never take the shortcuts through the woods again. They're patient, and they wait for travelers like you." I nodded, grateful, though I didn't know if I could trust him completely. I filled my tank at the station that had magically appeared along the main highway, leaving the forest behind me. The drive back into civilization was slow but uneventful. I kept thinking about those headlights, the whispers, the figures. I told myself it was a hallucination. Stress, too many late nights, but the memory of their eyes, the intensity, wouldn't let me. Months later, I tried to retrace the route during the day. I wanted to understand, to confront the fear. The roads I remembered didn't exist. Towns that should have been there weren't. Forests had shifted, fields appeared where trees once stood. It was as if that stretch of road had been erased from the map. I never stopped driving on highways, never took back roads again. But sometimes, when night falls and I'm alone on a dark stretch of asphalt, I think about those headlights, silent and patient, following, waiting for me to stray. And I wonder how many others are out there, trapped on a road that bends reality, forever pursued by travelers who don't belong to this world. Even now, when I close my eyes, I see them, standing in the shadows, waiting. And I remember the old man's words, "They never stop." Story, the end.